In 1897, 3 men from Sweden set off on an expedition to reach the North Pole in a hydrogen balloon. They left from the Norwegian archipelago in the Arctic Ocean, known as Svalbard, in July 1897. This expedition would end in disaster. Exploration of the Antarctic has been an off and on area of interest for centuries, with sightings of the ice fields dating as far back as the 17th century and theories about the ice dating even further back to around 600 to 300 BC, when Greek philosophers were theorizing that the Earth was spherical with north and south polar regions. But the isolation and the harsh conditions of this region proved too difficult for early explorers. The British explorer James Cook is known as one of the first to cross the Antarctic Circle during the late 18th century. The interest in the area would be renewed in full force in 1895 when it was decided during a meeting of the 6th International Geographical Congress in London, England, that Antarctica represented the final frontier. This meant that the race was on. This era of exploration has been dubbed the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. An age that began roughly in 1897, during which time explorers from 9 different countries carried out expeditions and scientific research in Antarctica. During the late 19th century, Swedish explorations of the Arctic were lacking, to say the least, while countries like our neighbors, Norway, had reached much success in Arctic exploration, thanks in large part through pioneers such as Fridtjof Nansen. The fact that Norway was such a force in Arctic exploration really irked the political and scientific elite of Sweden, who felt that Sweden should take the lead among the Scandinavian countries. Especially considering that at the time there was a union called the United Kingdoms of Sweden and Norway, which was a personal union of the 2 kingdoms under a common monarch and common foreign policy. This union lasted from 1814 until its dissolution in 1905. And Norway, becoming a world power in Arctic exploration, did not sit well with the Swedish elite. To put simply, they wanted what Norway had, much like a jealous sibling. And one of the people who held this opinion was Solomon August Andrée. Born in the small town of Gränna on October 18, 1854, Solomon August Andrée was the son of pharmacist Claes Georg Andrée and Jacobina Gustava. Andrée was very close to his mother, especially after his father passed away in 1870. He would begin studying at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm in 1871, and he graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering in 1874. After graduating, he began working at Göransson's mechanical workshop in Stockholm, and he would remain there until 1876, when he would first travel to England and then continue on to the United States, specifically to Philadelphia in the United States. In Philadelphia, he went to the Centennial International Exhibition, which was the first official World's Fair to be held in the United States. He would work as a janitor at the Swedish Pavilion, and it was during this time in the US that he became more interested in balloon travel. He read a book about trade winds, and he would meet the American balloonist John Wise, who was a pioneer in the field of ballooning. Wise would make over 400 flights during his lifetime, and he was responsible for several innovations in balloon design. Meeting Wise would jumpstart Andrée's fascination with balloon travel. Eventually, Andrée returned to Sweden and opened a machine shop where he worked until 1880. The shop was less than successful, and he would soon look for other employment. From 1880 to 1882, he would work as an assistant at the Royal Institute of Technology. In 1882, Andrée would come into contact with the polar region when he participated in a Swedish scientific expedition to Spitsbergen in 1882 to 1883. During this trip, Andrée was responsible for the observations regarding air electricity. Returning from this expedition, Andrée would be employed as an engineer at the Swedish Patent Office, where he worked his way up to chief engineer, which was a post he would hold until his death. But his interest in balloon travel never wavered, and in 1890, Andrée had the opportunity to make some trips in a balloon together with the Norwegian balloonist Frans Forsberg, who was considered Scandinavia's most skilled balloon pilot during the 1880s. Inspired by these trips, as well as his meeting with John Wise years prior, Andrée decided to get his own balloon. With the help of a scholarship, he was able to purchase a hot air balloon that he named Svea. With Svea, he made a total of 9 trips. During some of the trips that he made in Svea, the winds would pull the balloon out over the Baltic Sea. Occasionally, the winds would pull the balloon so close to the water that it hit many of the rocky islands in the Stockholm archipelago. The longest trip he took on Svea was when he traveled from Gothenburg to Gotland. During this trip, Andrée hadn't even realized that he was flying over the ocean, as he thought that the water he was passing was lakes and that he was still flying over the mainland. With his fascination of balloon travel ever growing, Andrée began thinking of an expedition to the North Pole, an expedition using a hot air balloon. He then began thinking of ways to improve balloon travel, and one of the ways he did this was the implementation of tow lines that he would test using Svea. The thinking was that as long as the balloon was moving at the same speed as the wind, it wasn't possible to steer it using sails. So Andrée had the idea of using tow lines to reduce the balloon's speed, which would allow the pilot to steer the balloon. Andrée was so sure that this idea would work that he claimed that with the help of tow lines, Svea would essentially become an airship. Now, it's important to point out that while Andrée might have seemed like he knew what he was doing to his peers in Sweden, in truth, he was a novice, especially compared to the more experienced balloonists such as John Wise. This has become even more evident in later years, with most modern researchers doubt his idea about tow lines. In fact, the Swedish Balloon Federation has theorized that Andrée's conviction was most likely nothing but wishful thinking. The tow line idea had many problems, such as changeable winds or the fact that Andrée would be traveling through clouds, which made it more difficult to him to assess where he was and in which direction he was moving. There was also the problem that the tow lines could get tangled, they could break, or they could get stuck on something on the ground. But despite all of these issues, Andrée was convinced that he knew what he was doing, so preparations for an expedition to the North Pole were underway. As I mentioned in the beginning, the Arctic ambitions of Sweden were still very much unrealized, and many in the Swedish political and scientific elite were eager to see Sweden take the lead among the Scandinavian countries as a world power in Arctic exploration. As such, Andrée had no problems gaining support for his ideas, and it didn't exactly hurt that Andrée was a persuasive speaker and fundraiser. One example of this is when he held a lecture in 1895 for the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, where he spoke about his plan for a polar expedition using a balloon. He also spoke of conditions that needed to be met in order for this to work. For instance, he outlined 4 requirements for the success of the expedition. The balloon must have enough lifting power to carry 3 people and all of their scientific equipment, cameras, provisions, and ballast, which he estimated to be around 3,000 kilograms. The second condition was that the balloon needed to retain enough gas to stay aloft for 30 days. The third condition was that the hydrogen gas must be manufactured and the balloon filled at the Arctic launch site. And the fourth and final requirement was that the balloon had to be at least somewhat steerable. Andrée was confident that all of these requirements would be easy to fulfill, and he claimed that larger balloons than the one he planned to use had already been constructed in France, and that these balloons were more airtight and remained hydrogen-filled for over a year without loss of buoyancy. He claimed that summer weather in the Arctic was very suitable for ballooning, with the midnight sun enabling observations around the clock, which would cut the voyage time in half and remove the need for anchoring at night. He would also claim that the cold weather wouldn't be an issue either, with his own drag rope steering technique being well adapted for a region where the ground was low in friction and free of vegetation. He also claimed that any rain or snow wouldn't be a problem. This was very clearly a sales pitch. And at this point you might be thinking, had Andrée even been to the Arctic before he made all of these claims? Technically yes, he had been part of the expedition to Spitsbergen in 1882, which was a year-long expedition. But let me explain what that expedition entailed. That expedition was part of something called the International Polar Year, which was an international research project to explore the Arctic and Antarctic. This was a project that took 7 years to prepare for and had 11 countries participating in it. And these countries were Austria-Hungary, Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Russia, Great Britain, Canada, and the United States. And this project was set up with 12 research stations in the Arctic area and 2 in Antarctica. Andrée was part of the Swedish Physical Meteorological Expedition that had its main base on Cape Torsen by the Isfjorden on the west coast of Spitsbergen. It was managed by Nils Ekholm, who was an experienced meteorologist, and Andrée was his second. There were also 3 other natural science researchers, a doctor, and 6 assistants. In other words, while he had spent a year in the Arctic, this experience that he had in the Arctic was part of an international research project that had been under preparation for 7 years by experienced people before it was finally embarked upon. It was also a project that he was not the leader of. It was also an expedition where he mostly remained in one spot, a base that was previously set up for this very purpose, which is very different from this balloon expedition that he was planning. So technically he did have some experience in the Arctic, but it was very minimal. But the important thing here is that even if his experience was minimal, it was still more than most people attending this particular lecture had. These people were completely disconnected from the realities of the Arctic. This led to the Royal Swedish Academy approving Andrée's expense calculation, and this would cause a ripple effect in which others rushed to support his project. People such as King Oscar II and Alfred Nobel would also contribute to the project. The project would also gain international attention. The press in Europe as well as the United States would fan interest in this project, and they would give a wide range of predictions, which ranged from certain deaths to a successful expedition. But for all the faith that many people had in the project, there were those who were very critical. And unsurprisingly, the first informed criticism came from outside of Sweden. Andrée was Sweden's first balloonist, which meant that there was no one in Sweden who had the experience or knowledge to question his ideas or offer any constructive criticism. As I mentioned before, while he might have seen as an authority in Sweden, looking at the bigger picture, he was very much a novice, which meant that when the rest of the world gained an interest in the project, there were those with far more knowledge or experience that began questioning his project. For instance, both France and Germany had long traditions of balloon travel, and many of those balloonists were far more experienced than Andrée, so they would express a lot of skepticism about Andrée's methods and his ideas. But these, in many ways warranted criticisms, fell on deaf ears. Andrée paid them no mind and he kept working on his project, convinced that he knew what he was doing. He began working with well-known aeronaut and balloon builder Henri Lachambre in Paris, and he would order a varnished 3-layer silk balloon which was 20.5 meters in diameter from the workshop in Paris. This balloon would be given the name the Eagle. The first attempt at this expedition was launched in 1896. As many people in Sweden still believed in Andrée's vision, he had plenty of volunteers for this expedition. The two men selected for this expedition were Nils Ekholm and Niels Strindberg, who was a brilliant student doing original research in physics and chemistry. He was also an amateur photographer, which worked perfectly with the expedition, as the main purpose of this expedition was mapping the area by means of aerial photography. In terms of scientific and technical skills, this was a pretty solid team, but with one glaring omission. All of them lacked training in how to survive under extreme conditions. All three of these men, Andrée, Ekholm and Strindberg, were more accustomed to being indoors. Physical prowess or survival skills was not something that Andrée was prioritizing, as he was expecting this trip to be calm and without any difficulties. But difficulties would find them. One big difficulty was the wind. The wind would blow steadily from the north, straight at the balloon hangar, which was located at Danes Island, Svalbard. The winds were so relentless that the team eventually had to give up. They packed up, let the hydrogen out of the balloon, and went home. Andrée, Strindberg and Ekholm had all been seen off by cheering crowds in Stockholm and Gothenburg. And now they were returning home after failing to even get the balloon in the air. At some point, Ekholm had become very skeptical of the balloon's ability to retain hydrogen. He would do his own buoyancy checks in the summer of 1896. These checks made him determine that the balloon leaked too much, and he began having serious doubt that the balloon would ever reach its destination. According to his calculations that were based on how much lift force the balloon was losing, the heavy load it was carrying, and the leakage coming from tiny stitching holes along the seams, Ekholm estimated that the balloon would only be able to stay airborne for 17 days at most, and not the promised 30. All of this made Ekholm second-guess his involvement in this expedition, and by the time they departed Danes Island, he told Andrée that unless he acquired a stronger balloon that was sealed better, he would not participate in the next attempt that was planned for the next year. But once again, Andrée refused to listen. As for the strange anomalies that Ekholm had noticed when doing his own measures, that would later be explained by the chief engineer of the hydrogen plant, as he had learned that Andrée would order extra topping up of the hydrogen in the balloon in secret. It's unclear why he would do this, but it's possible that the media frenzy surrounding this expedition was clouding his judgment a bit. All the sponsors and the media were following every step of this project, and they wanted results, especially with the success that Norway was having. So it's possible that the pressure played a huge part in this decision. It has been theorized in later years that Andrée may not have wanted any mistakes on his part to be known by anyone. The failure of this first expedition meant that there weren't as many volunteers waiting to join the second attempt in 1897, because by now more and more people had begun asking questions. True to his word, Ekholm was not part of the second attempt, as Andrée hadn't made any fixes to the balloon. So Ekholm would depart the team and would be replaced by a 27-year-old engineer named Knut Frankel. Another thing that may have played a big difference in this second attempt at the expedition is the departure of Ekholm and the addition of Frenkel. Ekholm was an authority in his field, and he had become very critical of the expedition, so much so that he was questioning Andrée. Not only that, but remember that expedition to Spitsbergen that Andrée was a part of? Well, Ekholm was his boss during that year. It's impossible to say how much that played a part in their dynamic, if it even did at all, but it is something to consider. Both Frenkel and Niels Strindberg were in their mid-20s, which left Andrée as the senior member of the team. These two young men were not as likely to question Andrée as Ekholm had been, and this meant that Andrée's leadership role would grow even stronger and give him more authority. In the summer of 1897, the team returned to Danes Island. When arriving, they were pleased to find that the balloon hangar that was built the year before had weathered the winter storms very well, and this time the winds were more favorable. On July 11th, the three explorers would climb into the basket. Before they departed, Andrée would dictate one telegram to King Oscar and another to the newspaper Aftonbladet. After he had done that, the support team cut away the ropes holding the balloon and it slowly rose into the sky. But it wouldn't be long until the first problem occurred. As the balloon traveled out over the water, the friction caused by the drag ropes would pull the balloon so far down that it almost ended up in the water. This friction also caused the ropes to twitch and detach from their screw holes. As these ropes detached, the three men would also dump 210 kilograms of sand overboard to get the basket up in the air again. Despite Andrée's assurances and frankly empty promises that his drag rope idea would turn the Eagle into a steerable aircraft, within a few minutes the Eagle was just an ordinary hydrogen balloon again, and was now completely at the mercy of the wind. After dumping all of the sand, the balloon would rise 700 meters into the air, which presented the second problem. Andrée hadn't bothered to fix the leakage that Ekholm had reported, and now, with higher altitude and lower air pressure, the hydrogen was escaping much faster through those very same stitching holes that Ekholm had discovered were leaking. The balloon had two means of communication: buoys and homing pigeons. The buoys were steel cylinders that were encased in cork that were intended to be dropped from the balloon into the water or onto the ice to be carried by the currents, similar to a message in a bottle. Only two of those cylinders were ever found. The homing pigeons had been supplied by the newspaper Aftonbladet. The pigeons were bred in northern Norway, and the hope was that the birds would return there. The message cylinders that the birds were carrying contained pre-printed instructions in Norwegian that asked the finder to pass the messages on to the address of the newspaper in Stockholm. 4 of these pigeons would be released, but only one was ever retrieved. This message said that the journey was going well. Of course, this was not the truth. The journey had been encountering problems from the very beginning, which Andrée would note in his personal journal. After dumping all of the sand, the balloon was now flying too high, which meant that the hydrogen was leaking out faster. The balloon would also be weighed down by rain, which meant that the balloon was once again sinking into the ocean, which left the men to desperately trying to keep it airborne by throwing all of the sand and some of the payload overboard. Free flight of the balloon is believed to have lasted for around 10 hours and 29 minutes, followed by another 41 hours where the balloon frequently made contact with the ground before it finally crashed. Altogether, the Eagle traveled for 2 days and 3.5 hours, during which time none of the men aboard got any sleep. Despite me describing it as a crash, the landing does appear to have been gentle, as neither the men nor the homing pigeons were hurt and none of the equipment was damaged. But they were now stranded. After landing, they were about 482 kilometers south of the pole. The Eagle had been stocked with safety equipment such as guns, snowshoes, sleds, skis, a tent, and a small boat. The men would spend about a week selecting what to pack. They also discussed where they would go. They decided that heading towards the North Pole was not an option, and eventually they decided to head towards Cape Flora in Franz Josef Land, which was one of 2 depots of food and ammunition that they had arranged to be left for them by the captain of a ship. They had brought food with them, but it was food better suited for a balloon voyage than a trek on foot. And with the problems they had had with the balloon leaking and constantly being in danger of crashing into the ocean, some of the food had been thrown overboard to maintain altitude. After spending a week at this temporary camp, they would bring most of the remaining food, guns, tent, ammunition, and cooking utensils with them. Each sled would be carrying a load of more than 200 kilograms. I should stop here and point out that the reason we know all of this is that all 3 men kept journals of this time. And Strindberg would take several pictures to document everything. He would also note in his own journal that the sleds were very hard to pull, and sometimes it took all 3 men to pull just one sled before they had to go back and get another sled. It's unclear how long this journey lasted before they decided to lighten the load of the sleds. The risk of the sleds breaking and the men getting too tired was too great. So they left a big pile of food and non-essential equipment behind and had managed to bring the loads down to 130 kilograms per sled. This did make the sleds somewhat easier to pull, but now they had less food, which meant that they had to hunt. And during their trek, they would shoot various animals such as seals, walruses, and polar bears. This trek was no easier than their flight had been. They would build bridges by bringing ice floes together or use axes to make tracks for the runners of their sleds. But sometimes the ice would give away, causing either the men or the sleds to fall into the water. They had started on this trek on the 22nd of July. But on the 4th of August, they decided that the trek towards Cape Flora was simply too difficult. So they decided to head for the second depot instead. As this depot was in the opposite direction, they hoped that the current would now work in their favor. But if they were hoping for their journey to be any easier, that would not be the case. The terrain was so harsh that they at times were forced to crawl forwards on their hands and knees. But they would occasionally have some luck, where they encountered open water and smooth, flat ice floes, which allowed for a somewhat easier trek. At first they did make some headway, but then the wind turned, and once again they were pushed backward and further away from their intended destination. They tried to overcome the winds by traveling more westward, but it was becoming more and more clear that they would not be able to reach this depot either. It was now the 12th of September, and the 3 men had resigned themselves to wintering on the ice. So they would set up camp on a large ice floe and decided to let the ice take them wherever. They built a home with walls made of water-reinforced snow, and Andrée was hopeful that they would drift far enough south to be able to feed themselves entirely from the sea. This camp would be their home until the 2nd of October, when the ice floe began to break up directly under the hut that they had built. But luckily for them, the floe was now pressing against one of the islands in Svalbard. So the group grabbed their equipment and remaining food onto this island itself, which would take them a couple of days. And now their new camp would be on this island, White Island in Svalbard, their final stop. The fate of these 3 men would remain a mystery for the next 33 years. Searches for them had been conducted for a few years, but those would eventually cease entirely, and Andrée's Arctic expedition became subject of myth and rumor. Even internationally, the lost expedition would be subject to speculation. But after years of not finding anything, most have resigned themselves to the fact that the men would never be found, lost in the Arctic. But as we know today, they were eventually found. The remains of Andrée's expedition would be found on the 5th of August, 1930 by the Norwegian Brattvåg expedition that were studying the glaciers and seas of the Svalbard archipelago. The island that became the final stop for Andrée's expedition was normally inaccessible due to a wide belt of thick polar ice surrounding the island and thick ice fog hiding it from view, which explains why they hadn't been found. But the summer of 1930 had been a warm one, which meant that the surrounding sea was almost free of ice. Since the island was known as a prime hunting ground for walrus, and with the fogs over the island being very thin, some of the crew decided to take advantage of this very rare opportunity. They landed on the island to do some hunting, and it didn't take them long before two of the crew would stumble upon Andrée's boat. The boat was frozen under a mound of snow near a small stream. It was still filled with the equipment from the expedition, including a boat hook that was engraved with the words Andrée's Polar Expedition, 1896. The two men went back to their captain to show him the hook, and when seeing it, he would immediately order the crew to search the site. Now actively searching, it didn't take them long before they found the campsite, as well as the remains of all three men. It may have been accidental, but Andrée's lost expedition had finally been found. The bodies would be returned to Sweden and cremated that same year. Unfortunately, there were no further examinations of the bodies prior to the cremation. Because of that, we don't know exactly what caused the men's demise, and the cause of death have actually been a source of debate for many years. All three men kept journals and diaries, so many people who looked into this case felt that perhaps those journals would give some clue. And thanks to those journals, we do know what happened up until those final moments. We know that they mainly ate canned and dried goods from the balloon stores, and they also ate half-cooked meat from whatever animal they could hunt, which was polar bears, walrus, and seals. We also know that the trek from the crash site was a miserable one, with the explorers frequently suffering from pain in their feet and diarrhea due to the food that they were eating. They also had to deal with being cold, wet, and exhausted. Andrée had updated his journal frequently, but on September 10th, those updates would grow more sporadic and with deteriorating penmanship. By the time they reached their final camp, much of the equipment had been left either outside of the tent or down by the water's edge, which has made some people speculate that by the time they reached their final camp, the men were either too exhausted, ill, or just didn't care anymore. The food is the most widely credited suggestion for what had caused the men's demise. A medical practitioner named Ernst Trude wrote a book called De döda på Vitön in 1952. In his book, he suggested that the men had succumbed to trichinosis, which is a type of roundworm infection. Initial signs and symptoms of the infection is diarrhea, which we know that the men suffer from. And this infection can be fatal, depending on the severity of the infection, with the infected dying 4 to 6 weeks after the infection. Thanks to the journal entries, we know that the group ate half-cooked or even raw meat from polar bears, walruses, and seals. So, Trude suggests that that's where they contracted this infection. To add further credence to this theory, larvae of Trichinella spiralis would be found in parts of a polar bear carcass that was on the site. For many years, this was considered one of the more plausible explanations, though some have remained skeptical, and some have argued against this theory, such as pointing out that more specific symptoms of trichinosis were missing. There was also the fact that Norwegian polar explorers Fridtjof Nansen and Hjalmar Johansen had lived largely on polar bear meat in the same area for 15 months without any ill effects. But I feel I should point out that those two men were more experienced explorers than Andrée was. Also, while trichinosis can be fatal, it's very rare. And none of the men ever wrote about having a fever or taking medicine to combat a fever. So while this explanation was the one believed for a long time, it's now one that most people don't believe in. But then the question becomes, if it wasn't an infection, then what did end up taking their lives? There have been a lot of suggestions for what happened. These include poisoning from the metal cans, an accidental gunshot wound, drowning, dehydration, a psychotic episode of murder, ending their own lives using opium, scurvy, vitamin A poisoning from eating polar bear liver, botulism, a polar bear attack, and asphyxiation caused by breathing fumes from a cook stove in a poorly ventilated tent. The crew of the ship that found them offered the simplest explanation. The men had died from cold and exhaustion. Many of these suggestions have counter-arguments. For instance, the men were aware of the dangers of eating polar bear liver, so they avoided doing that. Andrée was found with his gun right next to him, so his death isn't believed to have been caused by a sudden attack by a polar bear. Scurvy is also very unlikely due to the fact that the amount of time that they spent there simply isn't long enough for scurvy to be fatal. Asphyxiation from the stove also seems unlikely. One clue that the death was not sudden was the fact that Andrée had wrapped his diary in sedgegrass and placed it at his back against his rock where he was found, which made it seem like he knew his time was up and he wanted his diary to be preserved for their story to be told. In 2010, writer and researcher Bea Usma of the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm would examine the men's clothes and found what was most likely rips from polar bears in Strindberg's preserved underpants. In her book, The Expedition, she puts forth the theory that Strindberg had been attacked by a polar bear and died from his injuries. This same polar bear may have also injured Frankel, as he seems to have died shortly after this attack in the tent. This meant that Andrée was now completely alone on the island. He had no way of escaping by himself, and he knew that. So Usma theorizes that he may have chosen to end his own life via morphine. This theory is supported by how he was found. He was found in a semi-upright position against a rock with his diary pressed against his back, and there was also morphine bottles, nearly empty, found on the site. To conclude, the more recent theory and believed theory is that the two young men died from polar bear attack, and Andrée chose to end it all using morphine. In the end though, we may never know exactly what happened to the men during their last days on the island. Instead of the triumphant return that everyone was expecting, the nation of Sweden found itself in mourning when 3 coffins returned instead. At the time, the men were celebrated, and the Swedish historian Sverker Sörlin wrote that the procession carrying their coffins from their ships into Stockholm must be one of the most solemn and grandiose manifestations of national mourning that has ever occurred in Sweden. Over the years though, this expedition has been looked at with a more critical eye, especially in regard to Andrée and his behavior. The fact that he dismissed any criticisms and made promises that he had no way of being able to keep. One of the men that has been praised over the years though is Nils Strindberg for the fact that his photographies have left us with a time capsule, a memory of a time when they attempted and failed to reach the Arctic in a hydrogen balloon.